Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to a combo OSHA and MSHA webinar series program today. For those of you who intended to tune in to hear about the latest updates in process safety management and other stuff that OSHA and MSHA are doing, change of plans because of the developments in Washington, D.C. We are instead going to spend a little bit of time talking with you all about what OSHA and MSHA are not doing and what the federal government is not doing during this government shutdown, or more importantly, the few things that they are able to do and not, and what this may mean sort of going forward as well at some point when the shutdown is over. And I'm still saying when, not if, that eventually they get their acts together in Washington, D.C. and the shutdown ends. Uh, I'm delighted to be joined today by my partner, Nick Scala, who is the chair of our mine safety and health practice and the head of our practice out of Columbus, Ohio. I'm Eric Conn. I'm one of the founding partners at Conn, Maciel, Carey, and I chair the firm's national OSHA practice group. I've practiced exclusively in the field of workplace safety and health law for 25 years now. The first decade or so of that was alongside the former first general counsel of the OSHA Review Commission. We work with our employers to manage inspections, investigations, and enforcement actions, mostly involving OSHA and the state OSH plans, but some of the other alphabet soup of agencies that get involved in workplace safety and health issues as well. And we also provide the full range of compliance counseling, audits, training, program development and review, all that fun stuff. I'll let Nick introduce himself and then we'll jump in.
Yeah, great to be here today talking with you all and being on a, always enjoy doing a webinar when Eric and I get to get one going at the same time. But Nick Scala, I am, as Eric said, the chair of our national MSHA practice and a partner in the OSHA practice as well. And similar to Eric, just help companies all around the country, whether operators or independent contractors, navigating the same dealings that we do on the OSHA side, but with the Mine Safety and Health Administration, which sister agencies within Department of Labor share a lot of similarities, but there's also some distinctions there. That's what I've been doing for my entire career, not quite as long as Eric, but those numbers are starting to get up there. And then prior to that, I worked in the mining and construction industries through college and um, am a certified mine safety professional in addition to the law practice. But I'll turn it back over to Eric, and we'll go ahead and get started in talking about the shutdown and how that's affecting the agencies.
Yeah, now that we've established that I'm older than Nick, I think that means I get to go first. And so we'll talk a little bit about OSHA and MSHA during a government shutdown, or in particular this government shutdown. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the, how a bill becomes a law civics class here. We were trying to figure out if we could play the great tune and the video that goes with that. But, I think this is, you guys all kind of get this concept and you've seen enough of this on the news lately. But when Congress and the president cannot come together and pass a budget, which they almost never do. Usually what they do is they get together and reach some agreement on a continuing resolution that allows for the continued funding of the federal government while they, continue to try to work out a deal for an official budget. Well, when they can't do that either, you end up with a government shutdown, which essentially means that we're not officially appropriated funds for the giant federal government, for the bureaucracy and all the agencies that roll up under that, and really all aspects of the federal government. So that means that essentially we do the bare minimum to keep the lights on, and otherwise we suspend most of the operations, most of those non-essential operations of the federal government. And the way they achieve that pause of normal operations of the federal government is generally through a mass furlough of non-essential federal workers, or federal workers who would otherwise be performing functions that are considered non-essential functions of the federal government. And each agency within the federal government puts together a contingency plan, a shutdown plan, where they identify what are the essential functions that we will continue and how will we carry out those essential functions, and what are those functions that we will otherwise pause or adjust how we would ordinarily perform them, and who is going to be performing them. The way this has worked historically, and there's been, something like 20 or so federal government shutdowns over the years, and we'll see some of the data on that in just a second. Um, is I already said this, they talk about a furlough of most of these federal employees. There's a unique aspect of this particular shutdown where the administration is sort of threatening to and seemingly starting to take official steps and formal steps to treat some of these federal workers who are on furlough now, instead of a furlough, instead to be a RIF or a permanent layoff from those positions. Really trying to kind of use this opportunity, this shutdown, to carry out a little bit more of the agenda that they were attempting originally to carry out through the work of Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency, where we have seen already, just in the first 10 months of this administration, a contraction of the federal bureaucracy. We've looked at this at OSHA, about 20% smaller than it was 11 months ago. I think maybe haven't achieved quite the size cuts that they hoped or intended through that effort. And that effort ended statutorily as a non-government entity. Doge is no longer officially operating. Well, this is like Doge Part 2. Let's see if we can use this shutdown to drive even more cuts at the federal government level. So that's one of the things that's, I think remarkable about this particular shutdown, and will be really notable about what happens when this shutdown ends. Do we see those employees return to normal operations, all of them who have been on furlough, or are there some more permanent cuts? And another unique aspect about this particular shutdown is that typically, although not statutorily, I think in every shutdown before this one, there has been a pretty clear path for payment of back pay of employees who have been off on furlough. There is a lot of talk and a lot of threats from the current administration that there will not be back pay provided to those non-essential workers who were not working during this shutdown, and that will be another interesting aspect of this particular shutdown and return to operations, and what effect that might have on operations going forward. But generally speaking, you see some of the things that are generally reduced or paused federal services during a shutdown. But we're going to focus in particular on the effects of that shutdown on two particular areas: OSHA, MSHA, and the independent bodies of adjudication that hear disputed cases, citations issued by OSHA and MSHA. This is, I thought, really quite interesting data about the history of shutdowns. 21 since 1976, the longest one back extending from the end of 2018 into 2019 was 35 days. We're already, I think, 15 days and counting into this current shutdown. That would be the third or fourth longest in history if it ended today. And it is not ending today. I mean, Congress is not in session. They are not even in Washington, D.C. It doesn't seem like the parties are getting together and talking and getting close to resolving this. So it looks like this shutdown is going to be at least the second longest in history. And who knows, if it extends more than a month, well into the next month, it could be the longest shutdown in history. And, it seems like the divide in Washington gets greater and greater every year, every administration. So it is not shocking that, we might be looking at the longest shutdown in history. Another thing that's notable about that, well, and I guess we've said it already, right? The Congress is not there; they're not in D.C., they're not negotiating, and the divide is great. So who knows when it ends? I'm still saying when it ends as opposed to if. I do think the federal government will return to business at some point. but it'll be interesting to see who blinks first. Oh, I know the point I was going to make is that where the rubber meets the road is where the funding actually stops, where payments to federal employees and in particular the military actually stops, including for those workers that are continuing to perform essential functions. And that tends to be a pretty big driver for getting the government back to business. And we're coming up pretty close to that point. I think that will be within the next couple of weeks when all of a sudden, some key functions in our government, key people, including our military, stop getting paid. That creates a great deal of tension and a great deal of pressure, and maybe that's what drives the Republicans and the Democrats in the House and the Senate to get together and at least come up with some kind of continuing resolution. So, but for now, there does not seem to be a real obvious end in sight, and that's what we are dealing with. So, what effect does that have on OSHA? Well, OSHA to begin with is a pretty small agency, pretty small budget, pretty small workforce. Looking at uh, the number here, right, on this first bullet, these 1,664 regular employees at OSHA, which is, by the way, already a much smaller number than if we were giving this presentation 11 months ago. We've already seen more than 200 employees, I think about 260 employees depart federal service at OSHA over the last 10 and a half months. So that's already, a pretty material reduction in force at OSHA through those efforts of DOGE, through the fork in the road, 8 month severance offer with voluntary early retirement, with the mandate that with a hiring freeze paired with a mandate that federal workers return to in-office, in-person work 5 days a week, full time, along with this option of getting 8 months severance if you quit your federal employment. We already saw about a 20% decline in OSHA's workforce. Well, now through the furloughs that are a part of this government shutdown, another 1,200 of those workers at least are not working today. So we are down to a bare bones skeleton crew at OSHA of about 400 employees. I am, right now out at a really um, interesting meeting in Houston, along with the two former deputy assistant secretaries of labor, the one political under the Biden administration, Jim Frederick, and the other, the career deputy, who's recently resigned as part of this, voluntary early retirement option, Scott Ketchum. And we've had, a bunch of interesting discussions about this. And they said, look, this is not, 400 employees in Washington, D.C. talking about policy and doing all that sort of work. The essential functions of OSHA are out in the field. And so at all of the area offices around the country, there are 2 or 3 or 4 employees trying to do the critical functions of OSHA, inspections of really significant activities. So it is mainly area office staff that are among those 400 that are still driving the ship at OSHA right now. But when that's ordinarily 1,600 or 1,900 workers, and now it's only 400, there's a whole lot less that they're able to do in that regard. So here we'll start with what aren't they doing? What is OSHA not doing during a shutdown? They're not doing programmed inspections. And one of the things, if you had joined us for some of the other OSHA updates earlier this year, we talked a little bit about sort of where things ended through the course of the Biden administration at OSHA. And one remarkable thing that happened through the Biden administration is that they moved all the way to the point where they were doing more than 50% of OSHA inspections were programmed inspections. They were, inspections under the site-specific targeting program, targeting specific employers whose injury and illness rates were higher than the national average. And this big group of national emphasis programs and regional and local emphasis programs targeting particular hazards, targeting particular industries. And so even in the absence of a fatality, in the absence of a reported hospitalization, in the absence of a reported amputation, or in the absence of an employee complaint about a hazard that employees are aware of at specific workplaces, OSHA was still getting into and inspecting workplaces on certain target lists. And they got to the point where about 53% of OSHA inspections over the course of the last 2 years of the Biden administration were those kinds of inspections. Well, during the shutdown, they're doing zero of those inspections. So no programmed inspections at all. We had sort of forecast that during this administration, we expected there to be a shift to become a little bit more reactive, focusing more on fatalities, catastrophes, employee complaints of really serious types of stuff, more so than those programmed inspections. Well, as we factor in the effects of the shutdown and just the effects of OSHA shrinking, going from 1,900 to 1,600 employees means they're going to do fewer inspections. I mean, the administration itself, in a proposed budget, suggested they would do about 10,000 fewer inspections. Well, if they're always going to do those high stakes inspections, fatalities, hospitalizations, amputations, that means those 10,000 fewer are almost entirely going to be 10,000 fewer programmed inspections. Now put that on steroids with something like a shutdown, and I wouldn't be surprised if we're seeing, instead of 53%, maybe 20% or 25% of inspections under these programmed deals. But there's a bunch of other things that we want OSHA to be doing. I think every employer wants OSHA to be doing that they're not doing during the shutdown, and they're going to be hard for them to do in general with a much smaller workforce, with or without the shutdown. That includes things like compliance assistance, putting out guidance documents, putting out helpful new interpretation letters, hopefully, maybe even with a more of an employer or management side slant because of the current administration. None of that is happening during a shutdown. Less of that is going to happen even after a shutdown because OSHA is smaller. That includes also the activities like the what do they call it? The not compliance assistance, but the when OSHA comes out and does these non-enforcement types of audits, um, uh, co not cooperative programs, not compliance
Consulting.
assistance, consultation program. Thank you.
Yeah.
A little bit of a brain fart there, where they come out, by invitation by the employer, where we go out and apply for these types of audits, where they're not issuing citations, they're just giving you ideas for things that you could do better. That activity is not happening at all. No federal dollars are allowed for that. That is a non-essential function. And then the other thing, which sometimes we want, sometimes we don't want, rulemaking is completely shut down during a government shutdown as well. But rulemaking, we think of, do we really need another regulation, another standard that we've got to comply with? But rulemaking also includes the activity to deregulate, to rescind rules, to amend rules to make them more feasible and more customized to the kinds of work that we do, that we are looking forward to, that we are engaged with OSHA about right now during this administration, about the kinds of things we want them to be advancing. That's not happening at all. And it's going to be very difficult for the agency, even after a shutdown, to really do that effectively over the next 3 years, because OSHA is so much smaller, huge cuts in the rulemaking areas, and having to ramp back up with a smaller workforce after the shutdown will really stymie OSHA's ability to do the kind of rulemaking that we want to see over the course of the next few years. Similarly, most whistleblower activities, most 11C retaliation type activities are not happening at all right now. That's only happening in emergency situations, and it is harder for a whistleblower type activity to rise to that emergency level as compared to substantive enforcement of highly hazardous circumstances, imminent danger circumstances. A couple other things that aren't happening that we want to be happening are informal settlement conferences. If you've got an OSHA citation, either right before the shutdown began or during the shutdown, OSHA is not taking those meetings at all, But that also does not mean that our deadlines, our regulatory deadlines to contest citations or to abate violations, that those things are not paused during government shutdown. So what we've been working with our clients on is what we're calling a friendly notice of contest. If we're not able to undertake an informal settlement conference and try to resolve a citation before the contest deadline, we are working on submitting a notice of contest, but basically saying to OSHA, we're contesting to preserve our right to contest. We would still like the opportunity to meet with the area office and try to resolve this citation. And so if you want to file a motion to extend all of the litigation deadlines, keep the file at the area office. When normal operations resume, we'd love to come in and sit down and talk with you. But make sure that you are filing that notice of contest by the end of that 15 working day period, because this shutdown does not affect those deadlines.
Hey, Eric, I'm gonna jump in there real quick and just we've got a number of questions coming in the chat, and a
Good.
lot of them are around the same topic. But can you comment just quickly on if or how this would affect the state plans?
Yeah, great question. So this is a federal government shutdown, does not affect the states. Um, if it continues to be relatively short term, 1 or 2 months, it's not going to affect the states. Most of the states' budget is supported by federal OSHA. If you've got federal OSHA authority to operate a state OSH plan, you're generally getting about 50% of your budget from federal OSHA. So this could have a long-term impact on the states if the shutdown continues for a very long time. But in the short term or even medium term, it really should have no effect at all. They're out there doing their business, operating as a separate state agency, as though this shutdown isn't happening at all. If this became some sort of record-setting thing, I would consider those to be non-essential dollars that would be going to the state plans. And so it could have an effect. But right now, and I would say over the next maybe 3 or 4 months, if this thing was still going on, you probably still wouldn't see any effect at the state level. But it could have a long-term effect if we continue to not fund government, including funding the state governments through the federal government. It could have that effect, but I would be pretty shocked if it did. But it's so kind of business as usual at the state level. And the other things that are kind of business as usual, even at the federal level, are what they're considering essential functions to get things done. One is inspecting, and OSHA will continue to do and open inspections of imminent danger situations. And imminent danger situations are where there is a very high risk of a very high consequence event that the employer is not addressing when the issue is raised to their attention. This is that one area where OSHA actually has the authority to run into federal court and get injunctive relief to stop your operations, to make you cease and desist doing your business if you do not address that imminent danger situation. This very rarely comes up. You see this maybe once every 2 or 3 years. So this is, a fairly low occurrence situation that OSHA is allowed to do as an essential function. The more common things that OSHA is allowed to do and is doing, and we are seeing anecdotally in the field right now, is inspecting and investigating workplace fatalities and inpatient hospitalizations, that fatality and catastrophe fat cat inspection that they do. But interestingly, what we're seeing is they're not really doing those inspections. What they're doing is initiating those inspections. They are showing up when you report fatalities and catastrophes. They show up on site. They do the opening conference. In one case, we have seen an initial document. They do the initial walk around and an initial document request. But so far, and we're, just a couple of weeks into this thing, so far that's it, right? They're basically kicking off the inspection and then, putting it on hold, hopefully until normal operations resume and they can get back out there and finish that inspection before the 6 month runs. But right now, it's just been kicking off those kinds of inspections. They're also responding to some very limited number of employee complaints, and it's those employee complaints that essentially practically relate to that imminent danger situation. There's high risk of death or serious harm, but maybe it's not imminent. Maybe the employer is being responsive anyway, but they are still getting out and responding to those super high consequence, super high risk type of complaints. But otherwise, we're not seeing a whole lot from OSHA in that regard either, in response to employee complaints either. And where they are responding, we're still seeing some NOAAs, some of those notices of alleged hazard, where they ask you to respond, and some, like fatalities and catastrophes, where they are initiating inspections, but not really carry them out in a really detailed way, the way you would ordinarily expect the first week or two or three of a big inspection like that. The other thing that does still apply and that OSHA has to do is meet their 6 month statute of limitations to issue citations. So that's one of the things that OSHA is allowed to do, even if it's not a fatality or catastrophe, even if it's not a high risk of death or serious harm. If they had already initiated an inspection before the shutdown, they are authorized as an essential function to finish that inspection and meet that statutory deadline, because this shutdown does not change congressional act. It does not change statutes like OSHA's 6 month statute of limitations. So what's really interesting about that, and we're seeing this anecdotally, is they are finishing those inspections in the sense that they are issuing citations ahead of the 6 month deadline, but they're not really doing the work to finish the inspection. I've got a couple where we had been coordinating with OSHA to do management interviews where they had been talking about a few additional documents that they intended to request through a second or third document request, where they've not done that. They've just written the paper that they were able to write. If they felt like they had enough to issue a citation, they're just issuing it based on what had already been done to get ahead of that 6 month deadline, but otherwise not really carrying out what otherwise would have been normal protocol to finish an inspection. So they're meeting their deadline, but not really doing that extra work. They are still evaluating whistleblower complaints and looking for those kinds of whistleblower complaints, retaliation complaints that relate to imminent threats to life or property. Weird that the contingency plan talked about property, but I think it's if there's a potential event at a petroleum refinery or a chemical manufacturing facility or a mine. Those are the kinds of things they're still going to at least evaluate and potentially take some initial action on. But by and large, they're not taking any action on those events either, unless they might miss some statutory deadline to be able to take the action. So that's what OSHA is doing and is not doing. And I think we're at the point now where Nick's going to talk about the corresponding do's and don'ts at MSHA.
Yeah, so I think, a lot of the similar background applies, right? The universal background that Eric talked about with some of the essential versus non-essential, distinguishing the shutdown and how that affects the Department of Labor as a whole. And similarly, a lot of the background that we talked about with just the reduction in the size of the agency already because of DOGE and the hiring freezes. But there are differences, as I mentioned at the outset, between the two agencies. And so you'll see just at the beginning, one of the big challenge or big changes is the number of people that are going to be furloughed from MSHA versus OSHA and the percentage of the agency that's still going to be on board. So where OSHA had about 400 people remaining, MSHA is going to have almost 900 of its employees remaining. Similarly sized agencies, but MSHA regulates a much smaller group of workplaces, right? So, the Mine Safety and Health Administration, what they log right now is around 12,000 mines in the country. Um, and that is what they are tasked with regulating. And they do that with a similar almost size employee base as OSHA. And that's in part due to some of the things that we'll talk about on the next slide, what they're continuing to do, which is their mandatory inspections. Um, but with this, they did trim what they consider the non-essential personnel. They've also gone through and done significant limitations on travel, on what kind of support functions they're going to do. They have ceased all training programs. Part 100 conferences are what MSHA calls their informal conference or their district managers conference. They go by many different names, or a 10-day conference. But these are essentially done within 10 days of the issuance of the citation. And technically, the investigation is still open at that point. Um, they're not required, just like an informal conference with OSHA, to preserve your right to appeal, but those are no longer taking place. So we can see the agency kind of stepping back from those similar functions with OSHA that are not essential to its core mission, which is inspection, and which aren't mandatory to keep that function of inspection and enforcement moving forward. The technical support division has been largely furloughed, maybe some people involved for the purpose of additional investigations or ongoing serious mine emergencies. But for the most part, the administrative functions of MSHA have been seriously shuttered. They aren't going to be trying to collect penalties. They won't be sending out penalties, unlike OSHA. MSHA does not have a statute of limitations. So they issue citations as they find them, typically, but there is no statute of limitations on that. When they issue a citation, it may be the day the volatile condition was observed, or within a few days after that, and the fine will not come out for maybe a month, maybe 2, 3 months later. At this point, we would expect that citations may and will likely continue to be issued during inspections when those take place, but any assessment of penalties that is going to be delayed and will likely pick back up again when the agency reopens, and the federal government, I should say, reopens. They're also pulled back on state grants. Kind of MSHA does not have state plans, right? So they do not cede jurisdiction to any state to run their own mine safety and health program. MSHA does not do that, but there are some state plans that exercise and enforce and investigate in addition to MSHA, California being one of those that still does that actively. But MSHA does provide funding to states so that they can help provide training and resources for the industry. And those grants have been removed and are not being issued at this point. So to the extent you want to get a citation and you want to have a Part 100 conference, similar to what Eric said, we're encouraging people to get those requests submitted in a timely fashion, and then they will be addressed when the government reopens and starts doing these functions again. But if you don't file the request, obviously you're going to have a less opportunity to have that. It is done at the discretion of the agency, so you could probably file within 10 days of reopening, but it's best right now just to get that request. It's in their inbox, so it's there when they reopen if you really want to go through the process of a Part 100 conference. With respect to contesting the actual penalties and the citations in the formal manner. As I mentioned, those don't get issued at the same time that MSHA issues citations, right? You get that mailing maybe a month or two later that says, here's your proposed fines. Those do have a 30-day deadline to submit the contest. If you receive those packets immediately before the shutdown occurred at the tail end of September, or you're still receiving them because they were mailed before the end of September and they just haven't been delivered yet, do make sure that you are submitting your contest of the proposed penalty within 30 days of receipt. That will not be told. You will have to be maintaining that, even though someone is not registering it on MSHA's end right now. You need to have them submitted in a timely fashion so that you can claim your right to contest there. That is an important thing that you are going to want to make sure that you continue to do, just like the notices of contest with OSHA. What is MSHA doing? They are going out and they're doing their regular required enforcement, right? They're required twos and fours, or as they're called, because every mine in the country, when Congress passed the Mine Act in 1977, required MSHA to do 2 inspections a year at least of surface mining operations and at least 4 per year of underground mining operations. They are continuing those efforts during the shutdown. They are considered essential for mine safety, and those twos and fours are happening. Now, they're not doing as much of the ancillary investigations, compliance follow-up, or some spot inspections, but they're doing their twos and fours, and therefore there will be inspections, there will be citations. Now, what we're seeing is that usually the locations that are getting targeted are those that require less travel for the agency. So whether the employee is close to where an inspector lives or close to a field office or a district office where people might be based, um, those are the mines that are getting primarily targeted at this point, just because there's less travel involved, and it is easier logistically for them to knock those ones out. But those inspections are continuing to take place. Some of the challenges there come with the abatement. With MSHA, if you get a citation, you are required to abate it, even if you end up contesting it. And typically, the way a citation works is you get a citation and then you abate it and you carry on. And at some point, MSHA will come out and verify that it was corrected. Where this gets to be a challenge is when you have situations where MSHA issues what is called an order. And an order is different than a citation, that an order shuts down an area or a part of a mining operation. And to get back up and running again, you have to have the approval of the agency before you can restart operations or restart that equipment. Um, and those efforts have been hampered because the inspectors working on abatement is not expressly provided here. So it's a little bit of a difficult situation if you are in that scenario where maybe you have an outstanding D order or you have an outstanding 107A of some kind and it's impacting your ability to continue operating. You need to be diligent in pursuing getting that lifted with the agency, working through your issuing inspector and up through management, because there are serious limitations on what they can do in terms of abatement verification right now, which is a difficult boat for employers and operators to be in if you had one of those citations or orders issued at some point during this shutdown. So be aware of that. If you are in a situation there, just you have to be pretty persistent in your pursuit of getting that modified and abated and or terminated so that you can return to operations. And happy to talk about that with you guys if anyone is in that boat. MSHA will also continue to look into accident or hazard and safety complaints. They are again required to investigate those in person in the event they're made to the agency. They don't do NOAA letters. They will not send a request for you to investigate and report back to them. They are required to come out and do a actual investigation of a safety related complaint when it is made. And they are continuing to do that as well. So some of those core functions will continue to be exercised. They will look at doing some say health related monitoring, but really just when there's imminent danger concerns there. And then they will also look at targeted mines that might have continuing or ongoing issues with specific areas, such as uh, health or ground control. They will continue that. And then obviously mine emergency support. So a lot of the core functions of the agency will continue, and the enforcement is opportunity is there, but how they interact on the abatement side and on the other side of that is much more limited, which is a difficult position for operators to have to navigate. Um, but overall, the agency is much more functional than we see OSHA being right now. There's other aspects of dealing with OSHA and MSHA that, we've talked about in terms of making sure that you're paying attention to your deadlines, paying attention to your contest deadlines. And that is a lot of that is having to do with what's taking place at the Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission and the Federal Mine Safety and Health Review Commission. Now, these are both administrative bodies, so part of the federal government, that are designed to hear our challenges or our litigation related to enforcement of MSHA and OSHA citations. Um, This is who we have our initial litigation of a citation with in front of an administrative law judge. We can do our first round of appeals to the commission and its commissioners, and then afterwards we can enter the federal court system if necessary. Um, so these agencies, though, have been again cut back even more dramatically than we saw OSHA and MSHA, right? Because they are largely just adjudicatory in function, and OSHRC especially. So we see that Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission, it typically has 51 employees. All but one of those has been furloughed. So all the judges are furloughed, the commissioners are furloughed. You have one person who is an information technology specialist who will continue to monitor and maintain the infrastructure from the commission. Um, if you're filing things electronically, they will not be docketed, although they will be submitted and held in that docketing system, but they will not be added to the file. The docketing office is not working. And then commission says that they're going to calculate new deadlines once the shutdown is lifted. For the most part, if we have hard deadlines, we're adhering to them and submitting things in a timely fashion. And then they're sitting there in the docket once it's originally lifted. But we expect for both the OSHRC and FMSHRC, all the hearing schedules are going to be reevaluated and adjusted depending on how long we continue into this shutdown. I mean, right now we're at 2 weeks. Probably doesn't change anything material unless you had a hearing scheduled in this short period of time, right? But if we start getting into a month or 6 weeks or something longer than that, obviously, that's going to really be an issue that's going to have to be resolved for each individual docket as we push forward. Similarly, the Federal Mine Safety and Health Review Commission, it has a couple more people involved and not furloughed. They have 4 of their 51 employees remaining, and that is because they are there in the event of a mine emergency, or what they have described as a situation where there's a reasonable likelihood that a safety of a life or the protection of property would be compromised to some significant degree by failure to provide prompt adjudication. And again, that comes back to obviously MSHA is continuing their inspections. MSHA can continue to issue citations to shut down operations. And it's in part related to how we navigate those situations. And if there's a mine emergency and they're not able to get the necessary actions move forward, they could involve the commission to the extent the commission has authority to be involved at that point. Likewise, they're not going to be considering the documents that are filed. So we'll just have to wait and see and then pick up with OTRC and FMSHRC once the shutdown is over and the government is back funded again to see where all of our cases are. But for the time being, you're not going to expect anything coming back from MSHA counsel or OSHA counsel or the representatives of the respective agencies or the administrative law judges. But for us at least, we're still adhering to our deadlines that exist at this time, to the extent they still are able to be acted upon. So what's going to happen after we get back up and running? Eric talked about it a bit, but there's going to be a significant backlog, right? There's a lot of information, a lot of things taking place, information being submitted, whether that's about complaints or data or record keeping. Um, that's going to have to be sifted through when the agency gets back on board. In addition to those whistleblower complaints, right, that weren't even being processed because they aren't having to do with imminent danger of safety or property. So there's going to be a huge backlog. The agencies are going to have to start trying to dig through that. And there's going to be questions, about who is returning to work, depending on if these permanent layoffs end up applying to the Department of Labor. Thus far, they've been focused on a couple other branch executive agencies and departments, but if it gets over to the Department of Labor, that's also going to be something that has to be considered. So evaluating those incoming complaints and deciding how and when to respond for OSHA. Are they going to come out? Are they going to issue NOAAs? Are they going to initiate that investigation? Remember, they have 6 months to initiate that or to complete that investigation once it comes in. So there is some time there, depending on how long this takes for them to sift through that. With MSHA, it's going to be a lot of evaluating the whistleblower complaints and discrimination complaints, per potentially picking up and running with temporary reinstatement orders that are or requests that are in there, since there's very prompt turnaround on that, as well as digging through what there might be in terms of abatement issues that are popping up with employers, whether for not being abated or where there is abatement that needs to be verified to get people out under the thumb of a specific citation or order, and if that's a limiting factor for them. Um, and then, as always, shut down, people aren't getting paid. Even sometimes people are working. There's a lot of these essential employees that are working but not being paid. So there is as Eric mentioned at the beginning, just kind of there is a potential for morale to decline. Is that going to result in additional staffing reductions because people are voluntarily leaving during the shutdown? Maybe they need that paycheck. They can't wait for it to furlough to be turned back on, or they're laid off, or there's questions about if furloughed employees are going to be paid when it comes back. Now, I mean, 2019, a law was signed that said they would be paid when the shutdown ends, but there's discussion about how that's going to be applied moving forward. So, we'll have to see how long this one lasts. I think that's a big question for everybody. But once it does end, if, when that happens, there's going to be significant digging out for the agencies before they can push forward.
Yeah.
Um,
One,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say one really interesting thing that is happening and has happened despite the government shutdown and that involved Congress to make it happen was that there were some pretty significant presidential nominations that went through the Senate confirmation process during the shutdown. So we have some new leaders at OSHA and OSHRIC and MSHA and FMSHRIC, notwithstanding the fact that there's a government shutdown. Now, part of that is a huge part of that is because the Senate rewrote the rules for how they vote to confirm presidential nominees of under cabinet, under secretary level positions. The so-called nuclear option. This is like the third different nuclear option I've seen in the last couple of decades. They did it for some judges, they did it for Supreme Court justices, and now they've done it for under secretary, under cabinet level positions in the federal agencies, where it no longer requires that filibuster-proof vote. It doesn't require 60, just requires a simple majority vote. And instead of requiring an individual vote, individual debate time, and an individual vote for every nominee, they can be done as a batch. And that rule change, that nuclear option, went into effect right before the shutdown, and the Senate tested it out with about 40 or so new confirmed nominees. And we were sifting through that looking for, is there a head of OSHA here? Is there a head of MSHA here? And they weren't in that first batch, but, Senate liked that. I'm sure there's, some legal challenges and all that stuff that are going to happen. But they said, you know what, this worked. Let's do it. Let's try it again. And they did a second round on October 3rd. So after the shutdown started, and I think this round was more than 100 nominees were confirmed, and among them were a bunch who have a hand in workplace safety and health regulation or adjudication. And so the first of those that we took great note of was a head of OSHA. And, this is notable for lots of reasons. This is one of the first times you've had this batch confirmation with only a majority vote, the first ever head of OSHA that was confirmed that way, but also notable because, this is President Trump's first confirmed head of OSHA, despite being president for 4 years, 8 years ago. Right? Yeah, starting 8 years ago. So that was for the first time in OSHA's history that there was not a presidentially appointed Senate confirmed head of OSHA for that entire presidential term. The first go round, now he's installed someone in his first year in office, really only about a half a year into office. And that person is Dave Keeling. And also notable, not to sound political, this is a political appointment, so it just is political. It's a Senate confirmation. It is political. What is kind of notable about Dave Keeling is he is a sort of classic, traditional highly qualified, serious safety professional coming in to run the safety agency. And there are, just look around this, this administration. There are plenty of people who have been tasked with running agencies who don't have a lot of experience in the subject matter of the agency they're running. Linda McMahon at the Department of Education. There's a lot of examples like that. Keeling is not an example like that. He is not a political creature. He is, generally considered to be fairly apolitical. And he is a career-long safety professional. Spent decades at UPS, starting out as a union package handler, which I think is a big part of why he ended up in this role. You'll recall that the president of the Teamsters, in a fairly unconventional, extraordinarily unconventional move, spoke at President Trump's nominating convention. When generally you think of leadership at big national unions as being in the corner of the Democratic nominee. The president of the Teamsters was there, supporting President Trump's candidacy. And so he has had an outsized role in selecting the Secretary of Labor, and it was, suggesting the Secretary of Labor, who is a fairly pro-union Republican, the most pro-union Republican in the House, and also selecting, it sounds like, recommending Dave Keeling for this position, who is a former union member himself, and a serious safety guy. So he ended his 36-year career at UPS as the global vice president of health and safety, and took on another very senior safety role at Amazon for a few years before accepting this nomination to be President Trump's head of OSHA. It's also notable that his confirmation hearing sort of looked and sounded differently than a lot of other of Trump's nominees to run other agencies. He was not focused on how they might, shrink OSHA and cut OSHA and rescind regulations left and right. He was focused on some rules that he wanted to make sure that OSHA advanced while he was in office, including a heat illness standard that's sitting at about the 1 yard line right now, as well as a workplace violence rule. So he did also talk a lot about modernizing OSHA, which I think is a great thing, and hopefully we'll see that kind of work. So he's in the building almost by himself. Maybe he's out there doing inspections because there's not a whole lot of other staff at the agency. But that's a pretty remarkable thing to have had happened during a federal government shutdown. We have our first Trump-selected head of OSHA in the building now, as of a couple of weeks ago. Similarly, we have a confirmed on that same day, part of that same batch of 100 plus President Trump nominees, a commissioner at the OSHA Review Commission. And this is the first commissioner that we've had at all during the Trump administration. That commission has been sitting there with, it's a three-commissioner commission, and there have been no commissioners in that role since early in the Trump administration. There was one outgoing president, not even, yeah, I guess it was a Biden renewed nomination, Cindy Atwell, whose term expired earlier this year. But without two of three, you don't have a quorum without two. We've had zero for the last few months. Now we have one. So it's great, right? I'm hopeful that the commission gets filled up and they can start to decide cases again. I've got cases that would be on appeal there, or could be on appeal there if the commission took them up. But up until this point, there wasn't even a commissioner there to accept review of an appealed administrative law judge case. And right now, John Snare, who is that lone commissioner, could accept review, but could not hear a review. You need a quorum to decide those cases. So we're still hopeful that we'll see another commissioner nominated and confirmed through this more efficient process. But at least we have someone in place now. And John Snare is well known to many of us. He's a good friend and friend of the firm. He is a former competitor of ours for a long time, a private law firm, management side attorney representing employers, doing the same sort of things that we do. But before and in between roles like that, he has served some really, really high-ranking positions at the Department of Labor, including back in the George W. Bush administration as the acting head of OSHA for a brief stint. the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Labor for OSHA as well, and the Deputy Solicitor of Labor, one of the very senior attorney positions in government and in the Department of Labor, including as the acting solicitor back then, back in the George W. Bush era. He has actually been in the Trump administration almost in the beginning, appointed without requirement for Senate confirmation as the Deputy Solicitor of Labor, but acting as the acting Solicitor of Labor for much of the administration so far. There was a Solicitor of Labor confirmed, I think, through that first batch confirmation, a month or so ago. So he moved into the deputy role instead of the acting solicitor role, and now has moved over to the more permanent position he was selected for as the lone, at this point, review commission commissioner. So we're seeing some action in other roles, even where the government is basically doing nothing. And this is interesting because he is now confirmed at the commission, but he is not the IT guy who is the one commissioner position that is actually not furloughed. So he's got very little to do, but he is there. So it's the start, and we'll see what happens when the government resumes normal operations. So that's what's going on at the commission level.
Yeah. And so likewise, in the same process on the MSHA side, the Senate confirmed the Assistant Secretary nominee Wayne Palmer. So Wayne might seem like a familiar name to those who are used to MSHA. He spent um, the entirety of the first Trump administration, or very much near all of it, at MSHA in the most senior political deputy role, the deputy assistant to then Assistant Secretary Dave Zotezalo, and even served as the acting assistant secretary until Dave Zotezalo was confirmed. Um, so Wayne has been likewise nominated for quite some time. Back in February, he has been working in different various roles for the administration while awaiting his confirmation. And now that that is through the Senate, he is going to be prepared to take that position up at MSHA. So the agency now has its political appointees in place, right? And they have a gentleman by the name of Jim McHugh who is going to be serving as the deputy assistant political appointee to Wayne. The chief of staff is in place, and then Wayne will now be the assistant secretary. From a timing perspective, it's about on par with what we saw in the first Trump administration with MSHA. A little bit actually earlier than we saw Dave Zotezalo get confirmed. He was confirmed, I believe, in November of Trump's first year in office, and then the first administration. And so a little bit earlier than that, but he will take this role and kind of fill that position of being the assistant secretary after having spent time there in the first Trump administration. And then since then, Wayne has served at a National Industry Association as an executive vice president, the Essential Minerals Association, since leaving MSHA until his nomination here. So, definitely somebody who is got experience at the agency, has experience with this administration and with administering MSHA under this administration, expect him to hit the ground running with what are the challenges and also the opportunities there before him. He's obviously got quite a bit going just in terms of the enforcement perspective, some of the rulemaking that came out under the end of the Biden administration, most notably the MSHA silica rule, which is still in litigation, but set to be going into effect for the remainder of the industry at some point, right? It's on a judicial stay right now, but that will end in some capacity at some point, we think. And having his confirmed leadership there will potentially hasten the ability for that to either get resolved or go through litigation to run its course. Um, Additionally, we had at the Federal Mine Safety and Health Review Commission another commissioner confirmed there, similar to John Snare. That was Marco Rakovic, and Marco is formerly served or worked in the mining industry before going into private legal practice. Was a management side attorney in the mine safety and health, did a lot, especially in the coal industry. Was based out of Kentucky. And during the first Trump administration, He was a commissioner on the Federal Mine Safety and Health Review Commission, so he's returning to that role. He has been on a break. His prior term ended in 2024, and so now he has been put back onto the commission. The MSHA commissioners are appointed for 6-year terms, so his will be until August of 2030. Um, he is likely going to be the next chairperson of the commission, and he will be joining 3 other existing commissioners that are still in their within their term. And so it's an interesting dynamic. The other 3 commissioners right now were all appointed or reappointed by President Biden. All of them are fairly uh, left-leaning and labor focused. All I think each one of them actually spent time with either United Mine Workers or steel workers in some capacity. So he will be joining that bench, giving them 4 commissioners on site. But within the next year, 2 of those commissioners will fall off. So President Trump is going to have the opportunity to nominate at least 4 commissioners to the Federal Mine Safety and Health Review Commission, which could really reshape the commission and how viable it is of a stop for operators. Right now, it's like I said, it's fairly MSHA friendly in what their decisions are and where they're going. So, it's often looked at as maybe just a stepping stone to get to the federal courts for further litigation. But we could see it become a more of a balanced bench as we see the additional commissioners get in place. So now that we have our first confirmed, we hope that we see a couple more, like Eric, seeing the commission built out. We'll see the FMSHA commission built out as well. And I think that takes us to any questions. I know that there's been a few that have popped up in the chat. We've been attempting to get through those as we've been going today. Eric, did you see any in there that you wanted to
Yeah,
touch on
yeah.
before we got through today?
There is one that maybe we addressed it, but just to be clear, there's a good question about how VPP submissions and applications and recertification applications are being impacted by the shutdown. That would roll up under that compliance assistance bucket where considered non-essential activity and no resources are being dedicated to that during the shutdown. So if you've got, plans for an SGA type of audit or inspection, or a recertification application pending. Those things are not happening. Those compliance assistance leaders within the area offices and regional offices are among the groups furloughed. They're not allowed to even voluntarily look at their emails and respond to things like that. So those things are on the shelf for the time being, and potential to create that backlog that Nick was talking about, where it's not just, okay, the switch flips whenever this shutdown ends, and they're going to jump right back in and be able to efficiently move through that. They're going to be digging themselves out of a big hole. So, there's going to be work to do.
Yeah,
Uh,
Eric, and I saw another one that you might want to comment on, but someone was asking about any effect, or do you have any comment on the Chemical Safety Board and their hazard investigation group? I think that was one that we hadn't touched on either.
Yeah, I don't think I've looked at their contingency plan, but you could imagine that they're very limited. They're even smaller than OSHA, even smaller than MSHA, a little tiny agency. That maybe there's some, really high stakes event that they would be allowed to respond to. But other than that, my sense is without a statutory deadline to finish investigations, to issue reports, to deal with recommendations, open recommendations. My guess is that they're doing virtually nothing. That they might be one of these agencies that has 1 or 2 employees that are not furloughed, and they're not doing much of anything at all. That was the common thread. Have you noticed? Like it was surprising to me that MSHA staff is practically double OSHA's staff, even though they cover like probably 1/100th the percentage of workplaces in the U.S. and the size of the workforce, and that FMSHRIC is, quadruple the number of employees still doing work compared to OSHRIC. But the difference is statutory mandate.
Yeah.
right? A lot of MSHA's activities are mandated by a statute. And that, that means you have to comply with the law. The law requires MSHA to do those things. So those have to be considered essential. You can't just say, well, we're going to ignore that because it's not really essential. Statute says we have to do it. We have to do it.
Yeah.
Those things on the OSHA side are not statutory. The only statutory thing is finish an inspection and issue citation within 6 months. They're doing that. Everything else, is really a regulatory mandate or a policy mandate. On the OSHRIC side, those are all just kind of made up procedural rules about how quickly a complaint has to be filed or before a hearing is held. So those things that are regulatory or procedural are just not happening. Those things that are statutory are. And so you could probably follow that theme through all of these different agencies to get a sense of what's happening and what's not happening.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. And then I did see one question that just came in towards the end asking about the effect on MSHA silica rule. So MSHA's new silica rule that was finalized in 2024, that is currently under a judicial stay. It is not in effect for coal or metal non-metal, and it is not going to go into effect for coal and metal non-metal while that case is under litigation, unless it parties move forward in settlement of it. So right now, it is not an enforceable rule. It is a final rule. The rule is in litigation, but there is a judicial stay from the Eighth Circuit that it is not going into effect. So that's again the quick on the Silica rule there.
So just scrolling through, to make sure you join us for all of our webinars. You're here today, you know about the series. One thing I just wanted to do one last plug because we're a week out from it. If you all have California operations or folks out in California, we've got our annual Cal OSHA and California Labor and Employment Law Summit coming up next week on the 21st in Northern California and Berkeley, and then on the 23rd in Southern California and Pasadena. These are great programs. We've got the chairman of the Cal OSHA Standards Board joining as a special guest, the head of regulatory affairs with the responsibility over worker safety docket at the California Chamber of Commerce is joining us, and our California team and some carpetbaggers like me coming in from out of state. Please check that out and join us. It's a really great program if you've got operations and folks out in California. And it's always great to be in 3D and see folks in person. So that'll be great if we get a chance to do that. And that's it. I appreciate you joining us today, and hopefully the shutdown ends soon, and we can we'll all have a more predictable and more sensible approach to the business that we do, managing safety and health for your businesses and us supporting you on in the background. So thanks so much for joining us today, and we look forward to the next time.
Thank you all.